Hello and welcome to Communications Panel 2 here at the Sigma Xi annual meeting. It's really great to have students in the room today. Just want to throw out some questions to you before we get started. How many of you have started a Twitter presence while this meeting has been happening? One person, okay. Two people, okay. And how many of you have been on Twitter for a while? Just a few. Okay, well, today we have a great panel of communications specialists and experts, editors, and writers. And hopefully, given that the Sigma Xi motto is actually companions in zealous research, I hope today that we can make you think about becoming companions in zealous communication for science, because you are the future of science and the voice of science in the future, as you'll hear from the panel today. So we're going to get started now with our first panelist, Danielle Lee, who is our resident biologist and urban outreach scientist. And she's currently a graduate student and a postdoc in, good, thank you. And she has a lot of great ideas for communication. Thank you.
Thanks. Hey there, how y'all doing? Good. So, like I said, I've been blogging since 2006. I started a science blog called Urban Science Adventures. And a few years later, I started one, and that focused on urban ecology, and I was focusing on a demographic of young adults, teenagers, talking about, the biology and the life sciences that you could see outside your backyard. I talked about accessible science, opportunities, as well as translating science for those types of audiences as well. And then many, many years later, in 2010, I started a second blog for a more adult audience focusing on evolution. And so it was Southern Playalistic Evolution Music. And the focus was using hip-hop songs to explain evolutionary concepts. And what both of my blogs had in common, even though they were very different audiences and very different topics, was about speaking to particular audiences in culturally relevant ways. And I did that basically because I focused my blogging at talking to non-scientists. So as I like to explain to people, I science blog for mama and them. So if my mom and the rest of my family and folks back home read my blog, I want them to be able to relate to what I'm talking about and the science that's within it. And so, still using these types of, clues, how do we expand science communication to audiences that have been for so long not only underrepresented, but most importantly, underserved when it comes to science, as well as science communication? For those of you who may be familiar with either in your inner cities, most large cities, metropolitan cities have black newspapers, weekly papers, or if you know some of the major websites or magazines such as Ebony, Jet, Essence, I would challenge you to find a science section. They don't exist. And for most of them, they have never had a science section. This is problematic because when you have major newspapers and major magazines cutting back on their science sections, and when you have minority media outlets that tend to repeat what these larger mainstream organizations are doing, not only does it represent the fact that these minority audiences have never had science communication in the first place, but if they continue to follow suit with what the mainstream media outlets are doing, they'll never be inspired to get one because they're now closing theirs down. So the great thing about social media and democratizing our ability to share information with one another is that we can use blogging and tweeting and our own voices as scientists and scholars to communicate science to the people around us. And the first rule of outreach is you need to talk to audiences that you belong to. You need to talk to audiences that you personally relate to. And that all counts as broadening participation, and particularly with the financial incentives that we get from NSF and NIH and other organizations. There's no need to go to audiences that look completely different than you and you worry about misspeaking or you using the wrong cultural relevant clues. Talk to those audiences that are most familiar to you and then expand your outreach in that way. And so with these new audiences, I encourage you to think about those media outlets that you may listen to, or at least those of your friends and families. There are target ethnic media outlets, magazines, radio is also a very important medium, websites, and regional newspapers. Everything doesn't have to be national. Regional newspapers are very important, particularly to help you focus on learning how to cultivate your voice or even getting used to communicating with journalists locally. Talking about the research that you're doing right there at your local college and your local community, and using those personal interest stories in either community newsletters or weekly newspapers. And let's not be afraid of using our many styles to cultivate different voices. Multilingual media outlets are very, very important for translating information or interpreting it between communities and between languages. So even if you're not necessarily comfortable talking about your own research, but you're able to speak or at least write in multiple languages, just simply being able to translate that information so that it's accessible to multiple audiences is very important as well. Which brings us to the crux of science communication. Just like STEM has a diversity issue, science communication has a diversity issue too. As I had a conversation with someone just the other day, they reminded me that sadly here in the States, we do not have a scientific middle class, period. No matter which group we look at, we don't have one. And so we're going to have to cultivate essentially our own scientifically literate middle class so that we can help all segments of our society. And it is essential that we focus on and encourage new science communicators. For many of us, we don't comprehend what we have possible or available to us unless we hear about it. In my day, we used the newspapers. Now the internet's important. So cultivating many new voices and science communicators, whether you're a scientist who communicates like I am, or if you have journalist friends or you're a journalist and you want to focus on science and engineering. And I want you to see science blogging as a possible on-ramp to science communication. It helps you develop your voice, get used to style writing or style presenting. And if you belong to multiple organizations, consider journalists or reaching out to members of journalist organizations, particularly those of you in college, just like we have college chapters of Sigma Xi and Beta Beta Beta, these science societies, they're usually college chapters of these journalist associations as well. Find partnerships. The good news is journalists are always looking for stories. Having a conversation with your friend down the hall who's a journalist gives them an opportunity for them to be trained as well as you. It helps you learn how to communicate with journalists and other media people. And for those of you who happen to be at land-grant schools where you have agriculture programs, those are perfect opportunities to talk about applied science, which people are also interested in. So one of the things I focus on in trying to find ways to cultivate relationships with journalism school department chairs at HBCUs, which are historically black colleges and universities, TCUs or tribal colleges and universities, as well as metropolitan community colleges. These three types of institutions alone tend to attract not only many students and diverse students, but because they tend to focus on what I call the least likely candidates in so many fields, they tend to attract a broader range of individuals from many, many backgrounds, particularly first-generation individuals. And let's not underestimate the focus, the role that class as well as economics play in your voice. Classic example, so much of science has been dominated by middle-class individuals, middle-class white men in particular. How you problem solve, how you approach issues, and even the very questions that you solve address your own pain points. And when we fail to have the voices of people who grew up a certain way, for me, I grew up working class, when you fail to have those types of perspectives presented, not only in science, but in science communication, we miss those stories that are shared to those particular audiences. Because there's more than one way to communicate to people, because there's so many different audiences out there. And if you have a chance, and if you know any, please let me know. We're trying to grow a list of minority science and health journalists because we do need to amplify these voices. One of the other things I particularly focus when I talk to other scientists and science professional societies is that it is imperative that we start inviting new people to serve on plenary speakers as well as on the dais. We need to profile diverse scholars and researchers in their research. The most frustrating answer to get as to why panels consistently look to be middle-aged or older, white male at science conferences or plenary speakers is the answer, well, we just didn't know where to find them. Though there may not be as many as we would like, there certainly are plenty of scientists of color and scientists from many different backgrounds, immigrant families, first-generation families, inner city and deep rural communities that can participate. You need to do the legwork. Encourage your colleagues and as well as senior scientists to do the legwork to invite these people. I think one perfect place to start expanding that is in what we consider, most departments have seminars where you have speakers that come each week. If there was a deliberate attempt to diversify those seminar speakers, to up that by even 10, 15%, that could change not only what you're being presented at your seminars, but it changes the perceptions of the students in that audience. Because they need to not only see someone that looks like themselves, they also, if they tend to be a majority audience, they need to know that science is filled by people who also don't look like them so that they can become used to interacting with people differently. And then I think it's important to tap diverse STEM expertise for commentaries. If you do happen to read popular media, you tend to see the same few voices being quoted over and over again. And so I'm part of a group called the National Science and Technology News Service, which is a consortium of African American scientists and science journalists, where we're focusing on interviewing and getting media experiences and helping people diversify the voices and the expertise that are being quoted in papers and appearing on news programs. And if you don't belong to any affinity science societies, whether you belong to that affinity group or not, I would like to encourage you to do so. And then Diverse Scholar is a website that is a binder of CVs. It brings together people who have voluntarily shared their CV from diverse STEM as well as social science fields, so that it removes that excuse that we don't know where to find people to participate in programs. This last side is simply references. I think we'll try to make this available at Sigma Xi, which just simply explains many of those acronyms that I use. And the Diversity and Science Carnival is a monthly blog series where we focus on diversity issues, so not only profiling, but even those kind of professional development issues that affect not just scientists of color, but different ability ranges, LGBT issues. It's about not just diversity, having different faces at the table, but about making everyone at that table feel welcome. So it's also about inclusiveness. And so focusing on ways that we can make science through communication a more diverse and inclusive field so that we can include everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. A very important message there on diversity. I brought up earlier the Twitter thing. I want you guys who are on Twitter to go ahead and use it. Send out some messages. Get the message that we're sending here today as much as you can. Next up is Bethany Brookshire. She is a professional science blogger now at Science News, and she's going to talk a little bit more about using social media and the web to communicate science.
Thank you, Jamie. Hello. It's nice to see you all. So I would like to talk to you about the use of science in social media, which is more to do than lolcats, but everybody loves lolcats. So I included one, because I love cats. So I would like to start with a little bit of a poll. I got a brief poll before we started. There's a few of you on Twitter, that's right. How many of you are on Facebook? Aha! Pinterest? Really? Tumblr? Any Tumblrs? How many of you have a blog? All right. Also, if you are on Twitter, please follow Kelly. She's live tweeting all the sessions and doing it very well. So I would like to talk to you about how even on Facebook, where you think, you're just with your friends on Facebook, you can spread science and you can make your voice heard. And that's both good and that's bad. So we're going to talk about spreading science and doing it in a great way, as opposed to other ways in which it can be done. Also, I may have to leave pretty soon after the Q&A, but if you have any questions, please email me, please tweet at me, whatever you can, I don't know, shout, whatever works. If you have any questions, I'm always glad to answer them. So this is me. My job, my professional job, did not exist when I went to grad school. And I am only 3 years out of grad school. But when I started grad school, my job did not exist. I'm a professional science blogger. That's what I do. I work for Science News magazine, and I also write for Student Science, run by the Society for Science in the Public, spreading science to everyone from middle school to high school to college to everybody. It's pretty awesome. So, and I do it via the internet. And one of the great things about the internet is that no one knows you're a dog. Have you guys ever heard that phrase on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog? It's this common, no one knows you're a dog on the internet, but everyone can potentially hear you bark. And I say that potentially. Anything that you put on the internet can potentially become a big deal. This can be awesome. It can be great when it's used for good science communication. It can also be completely terrifying. So keep that in mind. Social media has social in it for a reason. So we're going to start with the good. This is the Science is Vital campaign. Science is Vital campaign was started in the UK to prevent cuts to science funding. I don't know if you guys know about the state of science funding in the United States right now. It's upsetting. It's very sad. It's very small. And they were having problems with it in the UK as well. And they started this campaign called Science is Vital on the internet. They got huge support from lots of professional scientists, from the public. They succeeded in stopping cuts to science funding. That's huge. It's huge. We could do that here. Why don't we do that here? And the campaign is still running, and it's going really, really well. This is a Twitter hashtag. Do you see the hashtag at the end in blue on all those little images? The hashtag says overly honest methods. This is a way to arrange tweets when you are looking at Twitter. And the hashtag overly honest methods was actually started by my friend Dr. Lee. And her first tweet is down at the bottom and says, incubation lasted 3 days because that is how long the undergrad forgot the experiment in the fridge. Because you guys do science. You write it in the methods and it sounds so pretty. Experiments were conducted under, 80 lux because one of the light bulbs was out and we didn't have the money to replace it. But you don't say that in the methods, you just say 80 lux, right? These were the overly honest methods. The Eppendorf tubes were shaken like a Polaroid picture until that part of the song ended. I admit to having done that myself, and the great thing about this hashtag was a lot of scientists who were on Twitter ended up meeting each other, which was really, really cool. But it also showed the world. It got out there, it got on national news, and it showed the world that scientists are real people. Real people who are funny, really funny when we try, and real people who have the same silly problems at work, just on a slightly different scale, like the third one down where we only recovered 2/3 the water monitors because a hurricane blew away the rest of them. Slightly different problems, but And then there's this. Does anybody recognize this icon? Anybody ever heard of I freaking love science? I can't say the other one. This thing says I'm not allowed to cuss. So has anyone ever heard of I effing love science? Yes, you have. It is on Facebook. And this is run by Elise Andrew. It is incredibly popular. If you ever see those little science memes popping up on your Facebook, that is what this is. It's huge. She has managed to take a bunch of images from all over the internet and curate them into this Facebook page and just get to millions and millions of people and get them to recognize science in their daily lives. So in these cases, scientists reached out. They did things, and the world listened, and it was awesome. Sometimes it's not so awesome, okay? This is cautionary tales. So a couple of these are things like the connection between MMR and autism, which does not exist. The victory in Portland, where they agreed to take all the fluoride out of their water, which is, by the way, a terrible idea. But they were scared of fluoride. And then there's things that scientists have put on the internet that have been a problem. So this is Jeffrey Miller. He's an evolutionary psychologist, and he wrote this tweet publicly. Dear obese PhD applicants, if you don't have the willpower to stop eating carbs, you won't have the willpower to do a dissertation. Not only is this amazingly untrue on every single scientific level, it's also, dude, what were you thinking? This is public. And you know what happened? He may be losing his job. because it got all over the internet. It got huge. Because he is a professor. He controls whether or not some people get into grad school. That's kind of a big deal. And then there was this guy. So this is Dario Maestripieri. My impressions of the Conference of Society for Neuroscience in New Orleans. I was at this conference. There are thousands of people at the conference and an unusually high concentration of unattractive women. The supermodel types are completely absent. What is going on? Are unattractive women particularly attracted to neuroscience? Are beautiful women particularly uninterested in the brain? No offense to anyone. So I was at that conference. Thanks, Dario. Thanks. And you'll notice this one was on Facebook. Your Facebook is not private. This was probably posted to friends only. Soon it was not. There is such a thing as screen caps. If you say something in your head and it sounds clever, sort of mean, and makes you sound kind of like a jerk, but it's really clever, don't write it on the internet. Just don't. Please. This is one of those cases where the world listened, and that was a terrible idea. And then there are all the other cases. So the thing about putting science on the internet is that you have to put in the effort. But it doesn't need to be half as much effort as you think it is. Everyone goes, oh my God, I need to start a blog. And if you start a blog, it's true, it will suck up the vast majority of your time. But you can contribute to someone else's blog as a guest writer. You can, comment on blogs, you can read blogs, you don't have to do it yourself. When you join Twitter, if you join Twitter, and I hope you do, Twitter is more about who you follow than it is about what you say. Because Twitter, as a content stream, you have to make it interesting. It depends on who you follow. You need to follow people that are interesting to you. Facebook, you guys all have friends on Facebook, and sometimes they may say things which scientifically you look at, and your little BS meter starts going off, right? And you have to decide when you're going to engage and how you're going to engage. Are you going to, talk to them and say, well, actually, I'm pretty sure that decaffeinated tea is not done with horrible, evil, cancer-causing chemicals, which happened on my Facebook. Are you going to engage? If you do, what is your probability of success? The involvement, the type of involvement, how you do it, makes or breaks your involvement in social media. Now, you don't need to blog. You don't need to tweet. You don't even need to be on Facebook if you really don't want to. But as young scientists, it is absolutely essential that you have a place for yourself on the internet. A place for you to show yourself professionally, okay? This is Bradley Wojtek, and you can see there on the big screenshot over there is a screenshot of his webpage, which is quite excellent. He's a young professor. At UC San Diego, and he has attracted the last 20 students and postdocs because they found his webpage and because they found his blog. As young scientists, people are going to Google you. There needs to be a webpage that shows who you are, that has your CV, that presents you in a professional context. When you become an expert on a topic, you will want reporters to find you. And so you can be an expert on that topic. You will want other scientists to find you for postdocs, for graduate school, for jobs. You will want students, potentially, if you become scientists someday, to find you. The internet is going to be where they find you, and that's important. And also, if you don't say something about yourself on the internet, if you don't get a jump on that PR, someone else will. And you may not like what they have to say. You want to get out there and you want to present yourself professionally, in a good way. Professionalism. If you wouldn't say it in front of everybody at a cocktail party, do not say it on the internet, as a guideline. And people say, oh, well, if you're going to present it on the internet and you're telling me to be professional, I can't possibly have any personality, and my Facebook's going to be really boring, and everything I do is going to be really boring. So this is me at the AAAS meeting last year in Boston, I think it was Boston. And as you can see, this is one of my professional photos. And it is not boring. It is also not personal. You can have personality on the internet without being personal. You don't need to tell everybody about every detail of your life, but you can be funny. You can say funny things, you can be witty, you can be personal, and you can be personality and have a great personality on the internet without letting it all hang out. I think people often mistake personality for personal, and you don't have to do that. So we're going to take questions after the next couple of speakers, but I just wanted to say thank you very much, and please follow me on Twitter, and we'll get to the Q&A soon.
A real life experience from the internet. Thank you, Bethany. Next up, we're going to have, and we're actually very blessed to have Corey with us today. Corey Powell, the editor of American Scientist. I'm going to leave it at that. He has a great bio in your programs and lots to contribute here. So thank you, Corey.
So this is my look at the new media landscape for those with a short attention span. So it's the future of journalism in 5 action-packed minutes. I guess you'll be the judge of whether they're actually action-packed, but I promise they'll at least be 5 minutes. So really, one way or another, you're going to intersect with science journalism. You're going to take your information from it. You're going to be giving information to it. There's a chance that you may actually be working in it, and so it's good to understand where this world is going and why it's going that way. So I'm not interested in sort of how we got here. I'm really curious about where we're going next. So I'm going to sort of look at where are science journalists coming from, and what are they doing, and how is it changing? So the first thing is that there's a proliferation of journalism schools, and I think there are 2 interesting things about this. One is that science journalism itself is becoming a much more professionalized field, and which is sort of paradoxical. More and more people are involved in communicating science. It's becoming much more democratic, and yet the people who are doing it professionally are often people with much higher degrees and much higher degree of education. The interesting thing that's happening on the flip side is that at the same time that more science journalism schools are springing up, communications and journalism programs are springing up within science programs. I don't know how many of you have actually run into this, but it's starting to happen. I'm in New York, and I see this in my backyard. Columbia University now has a communications specialist within the biology department. The Stevens Institute of Technology, which is a traditional pure engineering school, now has a communications department that's entirely aimed at teaching engineers how to communicate. Well, why are they doing this? Well, because those lines between science and science journalism, between those 2 sides, is a lot blurrier than it used to be. Scientists are expected to be able to give a good colloquium, to give a good defense, to write a coherent grant proposal, to be able to explain a poster session. I mean, the expectations of communication are much higher inside the profession, and that has a very fortunate effect that it makes, if you can communicate within the profession, you're actually in a much better position to communicate outside of the profession. Now, we've talked a lot about the ways that the communication methods are changing, and I don't think I need to explain to you that there's a lot of bloggers, that there's a lot of information on Facebook, that people are tweeting. I'll second the sentiment that if you're not on Twitter, or if you're not actively engaged in doing things beyond just chatting with friends on Facebook, those are great resources to take advantage of, and you should do that. What's interesting again is the changes that are coming with that. Who is an authority and where you can get your information from. It's changing, and this is again there's a tremendous upside to this. I think you hear a lot about the downsides of sort of the erosion of traditional standards of authority. And the upside is I can design a Twitter feed where I hear from I pick 24 astronomers, planetary scientists, cosmologists, physicists who are in fields that I particularly follow, who are interesting to me. I get an amazing range of understanding of what they're reading, what they're thinking about, what papers they're interested in, what's going on at conferences that I don't have time to go to, and there are other tools that are happening to sort of help people on the outside understand these things. The rise of blog networks, and Again, if you may not be aware of these yet, but you will be soon when if you start looking out more at where you read about research. Scientific American, National Geographic, Popular Science, a lot of the traditional magazines now have, they have sort of a branded group of bloggers, and these bloggers basically operate under their umbrella as sort of officially sanctioned bloggers. And some of them are scientists, some of them are journalists. Some of them are sitting right here on the panel. It's a way of sort of helping establish lines of authority and helping establish a kind of a review, almost like a virtual type of peer review. Another interesting thing that's happening that's sort of counterintuitive is that while everything's getting shorter into Facebook posts and into tweets, there's actually an incredible renaissance in long-form journalism right now. There's a site called Long Reads that points you to long-form pieces. There's a site called Matter, where for 99 cents you can buy some very beautiful pieces of long-form journalism. They're new online journals like Nautilus and Eon. You can buy Kindle singles and even entire ebooks. What's happening is I look around and I see people reading more than ever, reading in a more diverse way than ever before. And sometimes I see these statistics about, people are reading less. Look, here you can see, now people are spending more time in front of their computer and less time reading. And I look at that and I think whoever designed that study is living in a world of 20 years ago. That's insane that you think, if you're sitting in front of a computer, you're not reading. The people who are collecting statistics are not living in the modern world. And I tell you what I see, intuitively, and what I would actually be interested in hearing your opinions here later. I see people reading more than ever, just reading in a variety of different ways. I think the big challenge for those of you, whether you're going to participate in it directly or whether you're relying on journalists to get your own message out and to talk about your work, is that the economic landscape is changing along with the professional landscape. That people who scientists who blog and tweet don't expect to get paid. Well, journalists who blog and tweet often barely get paid either. Okay, yes, sorry. I just touched on a sore point. The economics of blogging and tweeting are terrible. So we've gone into this very, very strange ecosystem right now where when I write for a print magazine, I make 10 to 100 times as much per word as when I blog. Well, that system can't last. Obviously, print outlets are shrinking. Something has got to change. This is happening to some extent in the science journal world as well. You have open access journals. You have journals like PLOS One and others. You have journals over here that are incredibly expensive. You have journals over here that are open access, or places like the Los Alamos preprint archive, where I can read any paper before it's published for free. Somehow, again, these are both open questions for you all that you're going to be experiencing either professionally or on the other side on the receiving end. How do we reconcile these things? How do we reconcile the economics of creating journalism, and how do we reconcile the economics of being published as researchers? Those are big questions that we should all be wrestling with, and I would love to keep that conversation going. Thank you.
Okay, I failed to introduce myself at the beginning of this, and I'm going to fly through some of my presentation simply because of we're running short on time. But I'm currently an ORISE Fellow at the Department of Energy, which means that I am a Science and Education Fellow where I work on policy at the Department of Energy. And so I have a very different, to some degree, experience from pure science communication. I think about policy and how science impacts policy. And even my slides here, I might even skip through those if it takes me too long to get through what I'm about to say. Part of what the panel has been talking about is professional writing, blogging, tweeting, Facebooking, whatever it takes to get your message out. And a lot of people don't necessarily have the skill set to do that, or they don't have the interest. But the way that I came to science communication originally was I saw some policy things happening that I wanted to have a role in. And one of the things was that the science standards in the state of Texas sort of dictate the textbooks that are going to be purchased for the entire nation, because the state of Texas is huge. The number of books that they buy is important to the rest of the country, because once those books are bought by Texas, they become cheaper for other states. And so the standards that are set in Texas have an impact on the rest of the country. And in Texas, the standards are very controversial, because there are some groups who challenge what is actually in there, the age of the universe. Whether or not evolution is treated as a fact or just a theory. So I saw the importance of these debates, and that's what drew me into the science communication world, but still it didn't make sense. Science communication didn't get me there. I wanted to be in policy. But what I did do, and what I wanted to do as a science communicator, was get scientists that I knew to communicate. And so I created something called Science in the Pub. It's an opportunity. I got scientists that I knew on campus to come into a bar with normal people. Sometimes people didn't know that we were going to be putting on a science talk, and suddenly we would throw up a projector and they would be presenting amazing science. But we didn't allow the scientists to give their conference talks. If they came to us with a conference talk, we sent them back. And I'm talking senior scientists at my university, my superiors by far. I was a grad student. I said, no, I want you to talk about the science that you're passionate about. I want you to have that passion when you're giving this talk, because that's going to be compelling to those people that happen to be in the bar at the time. We created an amazing audience in a small pub on campus at the University of Texas at Austin. We ultimately had members of the House of Representatives, the State House of Representatives, coming as a political pitch. They wanted to talk to our audience because we had tapped into something that they wanted to be a part of. And this is important. This started to have policy implications. I graduated from the University of Texas and moved on. My friends who were there maintained Science in the Pub. But this is another way that you can be involved in science communication. And so I recommend that you think about that. Ultimately, what I did was I came to DC and became a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow. I served that 2 years at the Department of Energy. That allowed me, to work with the White House on climate communications. USGCRP, the Global Change Research Program, was forming a coordinated effort of all the federal agencies that provide science related to climate change. And I took over as co-chair of the digital communications team, which is the social media platform, trying to form a cohesive voice for the government on climate change. And so I wasn't necessarily the person who was doing the communicating. I was what I consider to be a communication strategist. I was thinking about how the messages have an impact on the debate. What are the best practices for getting a message out there? We know that science is becoming culturally polarized and politicized, and there are methods. It's now become a subdiscipline of science communication that is called the science of science communication. And people are studying this to understand how, when you engage in these conversations, the language you use and the stories that you tell, what the impact of that is on those communities. And we know that just delivering facts to a particular audience is not necessarily convincing. You need to tell your story in a compelling way. You need to communicate science in a way that taps into an individual's cultural personality, their identity, and they can relate to that science. Otherwise, if you're communicating science in a way that conflicts with their cultural values, they're going to reject it, regardless of how you insist that the facts are the facts. And so this is a critical thing to me. It's a different perspective I have. And the reason I'm skipping my slides is because I basically talk about what Bethany and Danielle have talked about, which is importance of diversity, increasing and being responsible on the internet, and thinking about science as a brand. Now, that's a very controversial way of thinking about science, because we don't want to think about marketing science. But essentially, some of the things that people are doing, we're talking about how to better deliver our science to the public. It does have a little tinge of a marketing component to it. But we need to do that with a very high level of integrity, which we know is part of Sigma Xi's ethics and integrity and research concept. And so I just want to take this opportunity to make that statement in a different way, to give you a different perspective on science communication. And if you don't want to tweet, you don't have to tweet. But your science is very critical to the public and will have an influence on how they view policy and how it ultimately plays out in Washington, D.C. And so I'm going to skip through my slides, and then I'm going to bring up Rosalind Reed to wrap things up. It was a really fun talk. I'm sorry. Does anybody know this guy, Bobak Ferdosi? The Mohawk guy. He landed the Mars rover. So, sorry I didn't get to talk about that, but I want you to hear from Rosalind. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie. I'm going to talk for just a couple minutes because it looks like our session's going to be shortened because we have this online audience that needs to move on. And we want to have time for a couple of questions and then later on talk with you later. This is actually the Council for the Advancement of Science Writing. Just lost something at the bottom. I want to give you just a few thoughts on using pictures to convey your science. This is a little bit more about the craft of what you all do. One of the trends that I have noticed is that people are using pictures all the time, Instagram, everything. The internet itself is a very, very visual medium, but I think it's still a very open question how we are going to really convey science successfully in this very, very visual medium. And everybody posts a lot of photos. It's so easy to take pictures these days, but I think science is not well served by just the sort of photography medium. I mean, you can have a lot of fun with it, but some of the information that you'd like to convey and what your science really is takes a little bit more thinking and a little bit more work. So something, when I was working on American Scientist magazine, this is a little more my credentials, sorry. I worked a lot with scientists on sketching ideas and finding new ways to convey ideas that were, sort of things that are not photographic but are conceptual or, sort of need a little extra work. And I want to encourage all of you to become sort of sketch artists, to sort of start thinking about how the way you think can be conveyed visually, because that will help you express your science as you go along. I look forward to looking at some of your posters and seeing how you do express yourself visually. But let's just think a little bit about how scientists talk. So some of the best talks, this is theoretical physics, are, sort of the blackboard talk, where you are starting to just think in the most simple terms. A scientist tells stories and tells stories with pictures, just as humans have done for millennia, just starting with cave paintings and moving on. Now, you can use pictures to show people how you think, how to think scientifically. And because I'm racing, I don't have time to explain what all this really is, but just let's say that the earliest science, a lot of it we know because people showed us how they thought by just sketching. Sketching, actually doing pictures, helps you think. And a lot of the most famous scientists have sketched to help themselves think. They have helped shape. Picture from one scientist has helped other people think about things. So the cell, it's really a 3D thing. The way it's seen in textbooks, obviously, it's very crowded and very 3D, and you need to sort of think about that. So you can capture the essence of scientific stories. This is an old one, so that your eye can help other people's minds understand your science. So I obviously am simply passionate and about using science, using pictures to convey your science, but not just by doing photographs and images, by using storytelling tricks in your pictures. So very quickly, very, very quickly, analogy. The ribosome is just like a hand in all its symmetries. So if we think about how to image the ribosome, we can show that by thinking of the symmetries of the hand. You can use an informal and colloquial style to make your science more accessible. You can organize arguments and frame your arguments as stories by making a picture that tells a story. So you can use simplicity, as the Japanese printmakers did, take out all that 3D stuff and just do something in 2D. You can use metaphor. Metaphor is just showing in physics springs for something, or rubber bands in a newer conception of something. So I'm going to skip my cautionary tale because I really think we should get on to questions and just say this was a kind of failed experiment we did in American Scientist a very long time ago, and what we really needed was this, which is a movie showing the true proton and how dynamic it is. So know that your pictures can actually show your idea of something, and please use pictures and draw. That's just my message. Thanks a lot. And I hope we do have time for a couple questions. Yeah, great, thank you. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to invite anyone who has a question to go to the mic. We have probably time for one before we go to another session. And I'd also like to offer that at 5 o'clock we can come back to this room and answer more questions if you want to. At least 3 of us will be here. Go ahead.
Hi, I have a question. So massive online open courses are, they have supposedly the idea to democratize education and provide more access to education. So how do you think, do you think that this is that massive online open courses are going to democratize education, provide more access to people, and help with communicating science?
Hello. Testing.
Gonna lose you.
Okay. Good question. I've taken a couple of MOOCs, actually, and what I have learned from taking them and talking to people who are actually teaching MOOCs, they do have that potential. However, like every other class on the planet, they are only as good as their teacher. Always. And that's something that I think people are going to have to keep in mind as MOOCs gain popularity and possibly become more official. You really are only as good as your teacher.
We'll keep rolling until we can.
My compliments to all of you, but I'd like to address one particular comment that Corey made regarding assessing the number of people reading. You know, just recently there was a celebrated, I mean within weeks, a celebrated anniversary of the paperback book. People see that? And the point was that with the onset of the paperback, availability of the paperback, entire populations of Americans who were sort of had excluded themselves for whatever reason, maybe economic and the price of a hardback, began to read because they could pick it up, they have it on the train, they have it on the beach, wherever. Now, with regards to, for instance, the bubble of 50 Shades of Grey, they said that was read more than any other book within that period of time. Why? Because it was available digitally on tablets, etc. Of course, then by having it on your tablet, nobody knew you were reading it, right? That was played into it. But I'm just wondering that are we excluding entire groups like we did with hardbound books that can't afford tablets or even smartphones? And that, I think, touches on what the second speaker, I think, was talking about.
Just to clarify, you're asking, are we leaving them out, or are they there but we're failing to count them? Which is your question?
Are we leaving them out? I don't think it's a matter of counting.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's being assessed properly.
I mean, I guess I would say there is this sort of fundamental question of is internet access essentially is it a human right? Is it something that everybody should have? And I think we're kind of at a critical mass level where it really is very difficult to participate just in the general level of knowledge and awareness without regular internet access. And so for a shrinking but still significant portion of this country, and certainly for a significant part of the world, that is a real issue. That there's this incredible democratization, and you want to make sure that it really is a democratic process. I think the change on the whole has been a positive one because I think the number of people who have access and the amount of things that they have access to has greatly increased. That doesn't mean that we're there yet. Yeah. Anybody else want to add?
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna. Can you say it in 5 seconds?
When it comes to access, actually, Latin American and African American audiences are the highest adopters of mobile technology. The difference is how we frame those conversations and how those websites are created to communicate to those audiences. And so for MOOCs, it's harder to take an entire class on a smartphone. You do need a computer. But if it's just reading information, at least when it comes to smartphones, those audiences have access. They're just not being communicated with in a way that's relevant to them.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go to the next session. Thank you all.